Good afternoon. My name is Rosalind Oliver, and I'm an attorney with a background in immigration law. Angel asked me to prepare a brief talk related to some immigration matters. I want to be clear that my talk is not intended to be construed as legal advice and should only be used for educational purposes. In talks like this, I think it's helpful to provide some historical context and at times definitions to help clarify where things might be fuzzy, so I will try to do that throughout. The three topics that I'll be discussing today are asylum seekers and refugees. Sometimes people wonder what the difference is between the two, and they're more alike than you might think. Secondly, temporary protected status, also known as TPS. And lastly, sanctuary cities and states. This slide distinguishes refugees from asylees. It's important to note the difference between an asylee and an asylum seeker. An asylum seeker is what it sounds like, a person who is seeking asylum. An asylee is someone who has been granted asylum. Also included the term migrant on this slide. It's more of a global or generalized sort of term for someone who chooses to move to another country, usually for work, education, or family reasons. In migration law, we often talk about push and pull factors. In a very general sense, a migrant might be someone who is more responding to the pull of immigration, so the lure of or the attraction of a better job, better schools, reunifying with a family member. Refugees and asylum seekers, on the other hand, are responding more to a push, generally speaking. So someone who has been forced to flee their own country to escape war, persecution, or natural disaster. A refugee is processed abroad, and an asylum seeker is someone also who has applied for the right to receive legal protection from another country, but they have not yet had their refugee claim determined by an official. So they are applying either at our borders or inside of our country after having arrived perhaps on some sort of visa or through parole. And it's important to note that it is never illegal to seek asylum within the United States, as some people erroneously believe. So let's dive in a little bit to the history of asylum and refugee. Asylum seekers and those seeking refugee status are both established by the same legislation, the Refugee Act of 1980, which finds its roots in post-World War II era framework created by the United Nations 1951 Refugee Convention, also known as the Geneva Convention, where it was first discussed what are the rights and responsibilities of countries offering refuge. And this was more specific to Europe at this time. That was followed by an amendment or kind of an addendum called the 1967 Protocol, which was adopted by the US in 1968. The 1967 Protocol kind of stripped away from the Geneva Convention this concept of geographical limitations. So no longer limited to Europe after the 1967 Protocol, expanded to all parts of the world at this point. So then there was the eventual Refugee Act of 1980, which was established by President Carter at the very end of his term, right before Reagan took office. This created a permanent means of accepting refugees and adjusting their eventual status, also setting up the framework and legal processes for asylum seekers. So significant funding was given to the refugee process. Also, the framework that we see within the refugee process overseas, all of these different details were worked out. So most importantly for our purposes today, the Refugee Act of 1980 was also where we see the same definition of refugee with asylum seekers and refugees. So it is the exact same definition. We're just talking about two different places where one would apply. That definition we're going to get into a bit later, but it finds its common core in the concept of having a well-founded fear, and we'll talk about that more. But again, asylum seekers apply at the border or inside the U.S., and refugees seek their remedy outside of the U.S., not in their home country, but in a country other than the U.S., where they do their original application. A little background on the refugee process. The numbers of refugees are decided on an annual basis, so there is a ceiling created annually by the President in consultation with Congress. The President and Congress also determine which general regions the refugees will come from. And once it's determined that you are falling in one of these categories, that will then allow you to create your application, to be prepared and applied, and then you would proceed with an interview. There's several refugee resettlement agencies that would help you with this process, and then a face-to-face interview would be done with USCIS abroad, which is the benefits arm of the Immigration Service. If you're determined to meet that definition of refugee, then there's a multitude of health screenings, security screenings, and then after that very attenuated process, usually months, years, you would eventually come to the U.S. Just talking about numbers, in a very general sense, the average number of refugees per year is generally speaking around 95 or 100,000. Biden's last year in office, he set the number for 125,000, but only about 25,000 had entered prior to Trump taking office. And on January 20th, the Trump administration did declare that there would be an executive order on his first day of his administration that the U.S. would not be able to absorb these large numbers without adversely affecting Americans. So the 100,000 refugees who were in process are basically in a frozen state right now. There's some talk about perhaps 12,000 being able to come because they already have their tickets lined up, but that is really kind of best case scenario as we can tell right now. The highest number we've ever had as a country, President Carter did bring in 230,000. So as the initiator of this project, he was really brought in a robust group. One of the lowest numbers we've ever had was about 11,000. That was during COVID. And another very, very low number was President Trump's last year in office during his first administration when he only brought in 15,000. So I won't get way into the weeds on this, but there have been studies showing that the net fiscal contribution of refugees over a 15-year period is $124 billion. So Trump's assertion that the U.S. won't be able to absorb large numbers of refugees really doesn't bear out in the facts. Basically, for every $1 that is spent on refugees, studies have shown that $2.14 comes back to us as a country. So there really is a huge gain and a blessing involved in welcoming refugees to our country. And this also does apply to asylum seekers as well. With regard to the asylum process, it has largely been hollowed out as well under the current administration. But in all fairness, it was kind of a death by a thousand cuts, hollowed out during the first administration, kind of left hollow during Biden's administration, and then more recently kind of attacked again under the Trump administration. So the asylum process is very onerous. Under this process, a person must also meet the multi-pronged well-founded fear definition, which we're going to talk about in more detail. To explain a bit more about asylum, there's two different paths. There is an affirmative asylum and a defensive asylum. Affirmative asylum is filed directly with USCIS, the benefits arm. This is generally pursued by people who entered the U.S. on a valid visa or who have some sort of temporary legal status. Affirmative asylum also is allowed in a special exception sort of way for unaccompanied minors, so children who have come here alone without their parents. And the impetus for allowing these children to have affirmative asylum is due to the trauma that they've endured on their journey, often in their home country, and just their young, tender age. And an asylum interview with an affirmative asylum application can be a kinder, gentler place. It isn't always, but you are dealing directly with an asylum officer as opposed to an immigration judge, and there is no prosecuting attorney in the environment when you are in an affirmative asylum interview. Defensive asylum, on the other hand, is generally for people who present themselves at the border or who were apprehended between ports of entry and then applied for asylum. But they must first also pass their credible fear interview, which is an interview undertaken at the border. And the process from there has really changed dramatically over the past 8 years. As I mentioned, they are now, or in the past few years, have been using the CBP One app, which was the avenue with which asylum seekers could make an appointment. It was very glitchy. The waits were incredibly long. And now, since January 20th, 2025, new policies have closed off the ports of entry for new asylum seekers. So we really are in a very devastating area for asylum seekers currently. With regard to refugees, I did want to mention that there was a small group of expedited refugees admitted, I believe in May, 59 South African white Afrikaners who were fleeing racial discrimination and a threat of loss to their land. Again, that was an expedited process that happened, months after this declaration that the U.S. could not afford to take in any additional refugees because of this cost. So that was, although they are welcomed and brought into our country, a sad moment for the people abroad, the 100,000 abroad who are waiting and have gone through such extensive interviews and such extensive work, screenings and work to get to the point that they were in. So this is the definition or the test that one must meet when they are an asylum seeker or a refugee. It's basically considered a 4-pronged test, and one must have a well-founded fear. A well-founded fear must be subjective as well as objective. So the person must genuinely fear the persecution. It's a personal internal feeling of anxiety or apprehension that they actually feel. And it must also be objectively reasonable that they have these fears. The persecution can be past persecution, or it can be a well-founded fear of future persecution. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. The persecution must be perpetrated by the government or an entity the government cannot or will not control. So an example of that particular type of entity might be the police or the military or the principal of your school, a relative, the gangs. It really could be a whole host of different types of people or entities who could be doing the perpetrating. And the well-founded fear needs to be on account of one of 5 things: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or a membership in a particular social group. Historically, people have thought of asylum as a political nature, and political opinion has been the prong that people have typically focused on or presumed that an asylum case would be based on. But in recent years, membership in a particular social group has actually been the prong that has been kind of the most fertile ground for asylum cases. A membership in a particular social group refers to a group of people who share a common immutable characteristic or background that is so fundamental to who they are that they shouldn't be forced to renounce it. So this has helped in many of our LGBTQIA cases. Also, it can help in some more gender-based cases and some of our gang-related cases. It also provides an opportunity to talk about multiple things like climate control as it relates to someone's gender and where they live. Former gang members has been a particular social group, and just gives you some particular ways to create a nexus to that persecution. So the size of the group really isn't a determining factor. You can be a small group and still be a particular social group. And there's really no universally agreed upon definition of what a particular social group is. And its interpretation can really vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And there's a lot of case law to help guide you with regard to this. I'll just quickly go through this slide, but it shows just some of the basic differences between refugees and asylum seekers. For example, refugees do have access to additional services. As I mentioned, when they come to the U.S., they oftentimes are connected to resettlement agencies who help them find an apartment, find job skill opportunities, help children get enrolled in school. So that's really a really huge benefit to being a refugee that asylum seekers really aren't able to avail themselves of, because there just isn't that sort of scaffolding or network created for asylum seekers. As far as business and work, both refugees and asylum seekers can work. There is delay when you're an asylum seeker with regard to getting your employment authorization document, or your EAD as it's referred to. Generally speaking, you have to apply for your asylum case, simultaneously apply for your EAD card, and that can take many, many months to get your EAD card. So although you're able to work as an asylum seeker, there is that additional delay in getting that authorization. Studying, both can study, and traveling outside the U.S., refugees are able to travel, obviously not to their country of origin. Asylum seekers, on the other hand, no. Asylum seekers are not allowed to depart. So next we're going to discuss what is a sanctuary state or a sanctuary city. Senate Bill 54, the California Values Act, was signed by Governor Jerry Brown in 2017. This Senate bill bars state and local police in California from investigating, interrogating, or arresting people for immigration purposes. It does not fully prohibit the police cooperating with federal immigration, but it does create significant blockades. Each city and town handles their sanctuary status differently, and there's really no one particular way to do it. As we sadly know, sanctuary cities are not safe from immigration raids, nor are they protected from federal efforts. So you can see in your neighborhood ICE, DEA, FBI, CBP. ICE was really intended to be the enforcement arm in the interior. They were brought in post 9/11 to take care of the inner parts of the country. But ICE is no longer the only agents that we're seeing. DEA, FBI, CBP, AFT, and as we know now, the National Guard, the Marines. Sanctuary cities, though, do not collaborate with immigration for law enforcement, but sanctuary cities cannot prevent feds from doing their jobs, and they can't prevent arrests. They can say to the federal government, you can't compel us to participate in your raids, although we know President Trump is threatening to charge and investigate those who are failing to cooperate. What do most sanctuary cities have in common? These are some commonalities that we see. Most restrict law enforcement from assisting in federal raids. Most prohibit law enforcement from entering into agreements. Most prohibit local jails from holding immigrants on minor offenses indefinitely, waiting for immigration to arrest them. So 48 hours is the max that immigrants can be held for minor offenses. Most also restrict police, fire, and other medical personnel from asking about immigrants' status. And why is having a sanctuary city important? We've seen that it's important because if every time an immigrant called the police or reported a fire or went to the hospital, they were asked about their status, immigrants would stop calling the police, they would stop reporting the fires, and they would go untreated because their fears would keep them quiet. So being a sanctuary city is really an important feature. So the last subject we wanted to talk about was temporary protected status, which is, as it sounds, it's a temporary status. So unlike asylum or refugee, it does not lead to a green card or citizenship in and of itself. But it is an important immigration benefit that is really kind of more of an emergency basis type of status, and these emergency problems can last a very long time and can be extended. So it's a temporary benefit offered by the U.S. government to people from countries going through crisis, so like a civil war or a natural disaster or other dangerous conditions. There are approximately 1 million people currently in the U.S. with TPS status, so it's not an insignificant number. The 17 countries currently that have some type of TPS are Venezuela, Haiti, Nicaragua, Afghanistan, Burma, Cameroon, El Salvador, Ethiopia, Honduras, Lebanon, Nepal, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, Ukraine, and Yemen. The one added most recently was Lebanon, added in October of 1994. The ones that have been on the list the longest are El Salvador and Honduras, really almost close to as long as we've had the Immigration Act of 1990, which was created, as I mentioned, by President Bush, and it gives the Secretary of Homeland Security the authority to decide which countries qualify based on these ongoing emergencies. And it may be initiated and extended in increments of 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months at a time. The TPS immigration benefits will include protection from deportation, eligibility for a work authorization document or an EAD, potential authorization for travel outside the U.S., but not to the country in turmoil. And TPS holders generally cannot be detained by DHS solely based on their lack of lawful immigration status, but they may be detained if there are other grounds for detention, such as criminal activity or security concerns. So it's important to understand that TPS status is by definition temporary. It doesn't lead directly, as I said, to an LPR status or a green card or eventual citizenship. However, TPS holders may apply for other immigration benefits that they qualify for while holding TPS. So it's not the only type of status that you can have while you're here, and you can try to transition from one to another. Let's see. Where do we stand now with TPS? The Trump administration, unfortunately, has announced plans to end TPS for Haitians, Venezuelans, the initial Venezuelans that arrived, so 350,000 Venezuelans, Afghans, and Cameroonians. In mid-May, the U.S. Supreme Court sided with the administration in a case that ended protections for this particular group of Venezuelans, the 350,000, which is now placing them at risk for deportation. The other 13 countries that I mentioned are perceived to be in trouble as well. People who are following closely the intentions of this administration believe that by the end of the 4 years, all of the 17 countries that currently have TPS will most likely have it eliminated. I think it's an interesting question. How do U.S. policies create the need for TPS? The U.S. does have a history of contributing to instability into several of these countries that are covered by TPS. In Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Haiti, for example, the U.S. supported totalitarian regimes and paramilitary forces, contributing to some of these conditions that forced people to leave. So today, the U.S. continues to push for increased militarization of security in Central America, exacerbating the violence and fueling the forced migration, all while advocating for trade and investment policies that deepen poverty and inequality. So our hands are not entirely clean when it comes to TPS, and I think President Bush recognized that in his Act of 1990 and really was part of the reason for initiating this temporary protected status. And in my opinion, and in the opinion of many migration specialists, that we really do have an obligation to continue this. So lastly, we do have a list of immigration legal sources. If you're interested in donating or learning more about volunteer opportunities, and that slide is here. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys at the next meeting. Bye-bye.